Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 51 of the Gospel of Luke, and we're covering Luke chapter 22, verses 47 through 71. This one's called The Arrest of Jesus. After celebrating the Passover meal together, Jesus identified his betrayer and encouraged Judas, "What you are doing, do quickly." Jesus had waited patiently for the cross, and we can see that when the process begins, everything happens quickly. Just before his arrest, Jesus sweated blood due to the intense stress concerning what was about to happen. Notice there is almost no time between the prayers of Jesus and his arrest. As soon as Jesus returns to the disciples, he comments about them sleeping, and while he was still speaking, the multitude came to arrest him. Let's read the first passage. Luke chapter 22, verses 47 through 53 says this, "And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, 'Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?' When those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, 'Lord, shall we strike with the sword?' And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, 'Permit even this.' And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders who had come to him, 'Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness.'" The kiss of Judas was not just one of betrayal, but was also one of complete hypocrisy and disdain. Let's ponder this for a few moments. What did Judas know about Jesus? Well, he had never seen Jesus do anything to hurt another person, no cruelty, no impatience. Jesus never complained, never blamed, never stopped doing everything he could to help others. Jesus never turned anyone away. What did Judas want from Jesus that he was not getting? Position, power, prosperous provisions. Judas was stuck in the flesh and was completely carnal. This kiss was way past betrayal. It was a prearranged signal to alert the henchmen who were there with Judas in the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest the right man. But Judas could have identified Jesus with a slap, a tap on the shoulder, or could have handed him a rose. The kiss was the most hypocritical way to identify Jesus. And after doing so, Judas expected the others to do his dirty work for him. I think that Judas had grown increasingly disgruntled in being called to serve others, and it was impossible to remain in the ministry of Jesus and not be aware that Jesus served others more than anyone else ever had. Remember, Judas was the only disciple not from the Galilee region. Jesus selected Judas personally, even knowing that it would end in this betrayal and the suicide of Judas. The calling of Judas by Jesus is a perfect example of the salvation offered by Jesus to everyone. Jesus did not betray Judas, nor did Jesus ever let him down or turn his back on Judas. Judas was not approached by the Pharisees, but knowing they wanted to destroy Jesus, Judas approached them and offered his betrayal for a small sum of money, maybe a month's wages. Peter, our act first, think second disciple, who has recently stated that he is willing to die for Jesus or go to jail for Jesus, demonstrates that he meant what he said, at least for the moment. Peter thinks the best option available is a sword fight and slices off the ear of Malchus, a temple guard. The response by Jesus is quite interesting. Permit even this. Basically, Jesus is telling his disciples that this arrest is what is supposed to occur. Peter demonstrated a lot of courage here. The disciples and Jesus were certainly outnumbered by those who came to arrest Jesus, and were certainly outarmed as well. Earlier in the evening, Jesus had encouraged the disciples to carry money bags as they continued to spread the gospel, and to sell a cloak to purchase a sword. At that time, we know there only were 2 swords in the group, and now we know that one of those belonged to Peter. Luke chapter 21, verse 38 says this, "So they said, 'Lord, look, here are 2 swords.' And he said to them, 'It is enough.'" While Peter's courage was admirable, it was not what Jesus desired. Once again, the arrest, crucifixion, and death of Jesus was not something that was being done to Jesus. Instead, it was part of the plan of Jesus. That plan had existed before the creation of man, and if that does not make a bit of sense, remember that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. He knows everything, past, present, and future. He knew each one of us before the creation of the world, even before we were created. God knew that he would choose the Jews as his special people, and he also knew that when he sent a Savior, they would reject Jesus. His plan to offer salvation to the world involved Jesus, his only begotten Son, dying on a cross. The perfect sacrifice to pay the price of all sin. That does not excuse our parts in his crucifixion. The Jewish religious authorities denied Jesus and desperately wanted to see him killed. They continuously broke the laws of Moses to get this accomplished. The Romans tried Jesus, convicted Jesus to appease the Jews, scourged Jesus, and crucified Jesus, and were also guilty. People watching mocked him, ridiculed him, and spat upon him. But don't forget, we were there too. As all of the sins of the world, past, present, and future, were placed upon Jesus, that includes my sin, your sin. When on the cross, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." In this statement, Jesus identified each of us as guilty of manslaughter instead of murder, as the difference between the two is intent. Because Jesus said that we did not know what we were doing when we killed him with our sin, we are not guilty of murder. Never forget the willingness of Jesus to endure this all for us. Never forget the willingness of the Father to sacrifice his only Son. There was no substitute sacrifice provided at the last moment, as there was when Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac in the same location many years earlier. Let's read the next passage. Luke chapter 22, verses 54 through 62 says this. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And after a little while another saw him and said, "You also are of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly. Peter remained courageous after Jesus was arrested. It is likely that the disciples were a bit surprised they were not arrested too. But Peter continued to follow Jesus to the house of the high priest. The Gospel of John tells us that Jesus first was taken to the house of Annas, the former high priest, and then was taken to Caiaphas, the current high priest and son-in-law of Annas. Both Annas and Caiaphas were Sadducees, not Pharisees. Peter remained outside in the courtyard while Jesus was being interrogated. Peter faced an interrogation of his own. First, a servant girl identified Peter as a disciple of Jesus, and Peter denied Jesus. Peter also said he did not know Jesus. The most interesting part of this to me is that Peter did not appear to remember what Jesus had spoken only a couple hours earlier, even though those words alerted Peter to a horrible sin he would commit that night. A man similarly identified Peter as a disciple of Jesus, and Peter denied Jesus a second time. Finally, a third person heard Peter's accent and dialect, which identified him as a Galilean, and assumed that Peter must be a disciple because Jesus was also from Galilee. Peter denied Jesus the third time, and immediately Peter heard the rooster crow. Only then did he remember the prophetic words of Jesus. I wonder if Peter also remembered these words spoken by Jesus in Matthew 10, verses 32 through 33. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. The response by Peter is completely understandable. Peter left and wept bitterly. There are different kinds of tears. In murder trials, when the murderer is convicted and the sentence is read, we often see tears by the one who has been convicted. Most of the time, these are the first tears we see from that person. The tears are selfish ones. They have nothing to do with being sorrowful for the murder they have committed. Instead, those tears are because they have been caught, have been found guilty, and have lost their freedom. There are also tears that are selfless rather than selfish. They involve sorrow for how our actions have affected others. When Peter denied Jesus, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. That glance cut Peter to the bone. Jesus warned Peter in advance, and Peter did not take that warning seriously. And then Jesus overheard Peter saying that he did not even know Jesus. That is a huge difference from the boast from Peter only hours before. I love you more than the rest. I'm willing to die for you. I'm willing to go to jail for you. Really, Peter? You are not even willing to acknowledge that you know me. The best part of this to me is to notice the vast difference between the sins of Judas and Peter. Betraying Jesus and denying Jesus are not so different. But the ways these two men stepped through those failures reveals a stark difference. Peter was sorrowful and repented, and Judas was sorry how his life had turned out. Without power, position, or money, he committed suicide hours later without asking for forgiveness, and Satan would sift Judas like wheat. Peter would be restored by Jesus after the resurrection. The failure by Peter would cause immense growth and make Peter more compassionate when he was teaching the gospel. Let's read the next passage. Luke chapter 22, verses 63 through 65 says this. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is the one who struck you? And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. This sounds like a cruel game. Blindfold Jesus, punch him, and then ask him to identify the one who delivered the blow. The restraint exhibited by Jesus here demonstrates that the cross was the goal, instead of being set free and avoiding the cross. Blindfolded, Jesus could have identified those who struck him by name easily. We tend to focus on the physical aspect of this last day for Jesus. He was punched, scourged with a whip that had pieces of bone and metal braided in that would pull out skin, nails through his hands, nails through his feet. I'm not saying the physical pain wasn't immense, but it did not compare to the pain of separation from the Father when our sins were placed upon him. Let's read the final passage today. Luke chapter 22, verses 66 through 71 says this: As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, If you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, If I tell you, you will by no means believe, and if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, Are you then the Son of God? So he said to them, You rightly say that I am. And they said, What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. The Sanhedrin consisted of 70 or 71 members, considered the elders of the Jewish people, and these were Sadducees, Pharisees, chief priests, and scribes. It is very likely that every member of the Sanhedrin was not part of this that day. I say that only because it is difficult to think that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea would have stood idly by while this charade was performed, when only hours later they would take Jesus down off the cross and prepare the body of Jesus for burial. Once again, the Sanhedrin had the power to convict, but not the power to impose a death sentence. That power was limited to the Romans, and particularly, in this case, Pontius Pilate, who was the 5th Roman governor of Judea. According to the Jewish council, Jesus was guilty of blasphemy, but that did not break any Roman law. This charade began with 3 religious trials, one before Annas, one before Caiaphas, and one before the Sanhedrin. In our next passage, we will see the 3 civil trials, one before Pontius Pilate, one before Herod Antipas, and then back to Pilate again. These were perfect examples of the term kangaroo court. So many laws were broken in these trials. Don't forget, Passover was about to begin. The population in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus was between 25,000 and 75,000 people, but during the Feast of Passover, there were as many as 250,000 Jews in Jerusalem. This increased the numbers of crimes and riots and added a challenge to Pontius Pilate of keeping the people under control. In the book of Revelation, we can see the judgments increase in frequency and intensity as the end approaches. At the cross, the same seemed to happen. This crucifixion moved from start to finish faster than the others. The Jewish authorities wanted to arrest Jesus and wanted to kill him, but they had decided to put this off until after the Passover week. Jesus had another plan, with this occurring on Passover, and we know which plan would come to fruition. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.